Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. This is the first out of a three-part episode program on all about plastics, and we are so fortunate to have Kirstie Pecci here tonight to speak specifically to the disposal component, which is often misunderstood a little bit too more often than we'd like, perhaps because of the synonym for the actual action of recycling when it's really just internal sorting in your home. So hopefully that will be something you'll take back with you and help educate other people with how this synonym is really an incorrect incorrect definition. But I'm not going to tell you what Kirstie is going to talk about because I believe she can do it 10 times better than I can, even do it in a summary form. But Kirstie Pecci is the director of the Zero Waste Project and the senior attorney at the Conservation Law Foundation. I'm very fortunate to have been able to partner with her on a couple of projects so far. She has been on a podcast at Sustainable Practices, which you can access on our website, sustainablepracticesltd.org, specific to waste and disposal, as well as been a star of a recent documentary on plastic linings, which actually dealt with the issue of plastic linings and single-use paper cups, which a lot of people unfortunately are not aware of, and therefore are actually eating and consuming products that are adding plastics to their bodies. So without any further introduction, I'm going to go straight to Kirstie and ask her to start our discussion this evening. Thank you, Kirstie. One thing I want to add before we start say is that we will take Q&A. Please drop your questions in the chat. I'm going to ask that all of you remain muted during the session, and I would really appreciate that. Thank you very much. Kirstie.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I really admire a lot of the work that Sustainable Practices has done in banning plastic bottles along the Cape. And I know, having done a lot of local work myself in central Massachusetts, where I live, how hard that is. So thank you so much for all your activism and hard work. So I'm the director of the Zero Waste Project at the Conservation Law Foundation. Conservation Law Foundation works throughout New England, working to protect human health using the law, the market, and science. So we work on a lot of different issues. Zero waste is only one of our program areas, but we have many others. So check that out, clf.org, if you want to learn more about the organization. But I started the Zero Waste Project at Conservation Law Foundation because really nobody was doing the soup to nuts work on waste issues. And we're going to hit the soup to nuts story, but just on plastics tonight. So to begin with, what I would like to cover today, let's see. Let's see if this is, there we go. What I'd like to cover tonight is that plastic production and use is very dangerous from the beginning and polluting from beginning to end. The problems with plastic disposal, as already alluded to, plastics and climate damage, and then plastics and environmental justice. We could do a full session on any one of these issues. I'll try and move right along because I know that this is a group who's probably already really interested in these issues and knows a lot about it. So I want to make sure I power on through and get to the question section so we can dive into the pieces that you're most interested in. So looking at plastics production and use, and again, most of you may already know this, but plastics are made from fossil fuels. That's something that a lot of people in the United States and the world don't understand. Plastic is really the fossil fuel industry's plan B. In other words, they know that we're no longer going to be fueling our homes and businesses and vehicles with fossil fuels. We can't. If we want the world to be livable, we have to stop. If we want to preserve our quality of life, we have to stop. So what they've turned to instead is plastic. And plastics are polluting, as we'll go into in some detail, at every stage of their production, use, and disposal. And really, plastics should always be your last resort. There will be some things that we use plastics for. I'm wearing contact lenses right now. Those will probably always be made of plastic. However, disposable, single-use plastic and the unnecessary proliferation of plastic needs to stop. So this gives you a sense of how plastic production has just shot up, beginning in 1950, and then looking at the projections that the industry has set. These are industry projections for what they want the world to look like by 2050. And to be honest, it's just terrifying. And remember that plastics, more than half the plastics are produced and made since 2000. That's something that's very important to understand. When we were growing up, we weren't using plastics in these kinds of numbers, and we don't need to be doing it now. And then the other piece of this that's really important to understand is that we're being told that consumers want plastic, that consumers are what are driving this, when in actuality, the industry is driving this 100%. So, I don't like to use the word life cycle. Honestly, I think of it as a death cycle. But just to make sure I'm using parlance that people know, we're talking about a journey that a plastic takes that includes extraction, meaning usually fracked gas, refinement, consumption, waste, and then the end life, many times in the environment. And again, plastic pollutes at every stage. Fracking is incredibly polluting. It leaves behind lagoons of toxic water. It does incredible damage underground into groundwater systems, and the different chemicals that present themselves and are used in fracking are very dangerous to public health. Not to mention the significant source of emissions. The same is true of refineries. You do not want to be living next to a fracking well or a refinery. And again, very energy intensive, very, very polluting, very, very dangerous, and very negative climate impact as well. This piece of it, consumption, is something that we're still grappling with the actual negative impacts that having plastic in our bodies will have on us. We know that there will be negative impacts. We're just not certain the extent of them. We know that plastics are endocrine disruptors, meaning that they will destabilize some of the most important systems in your body. We know they're carcinogens, and many of the chemicals used to make plastic, like benzene, for instance, are incredibly toxic. So, recently, not only, and you probably had heard about this, or you hope you've heard about this, that plastics were discovered, microplastics were discovered in placentas. I want to say a year ago or so. More recently, we found microplastics in human blood, and then we're finding plastic in living people's lungs. So people who've been operated on, they're finding microplastics in their lungs. That is terrifying because of how toxic plastic is. And so, unfortunately, once we make plastic, we don't really have a good way of getting rid of the plastic. The number that you hear is that about 8 or 9% of plastics have been recycled, but you can only recycle plastic so many times, so disposal is the inevitable end of plastic. And to put this in context, this is the pie chart of what Massachusetts disposes of every year. This is based on a survey they do of incinerators. They actually take the materials at the incinerator and weigh them on a series of days, and then they extrapolate what they think the percentages are for the year. They do this every 3 years in Massachusetts. You can see 16% of this are plastics. Now, what's terrifying about that is this pie chart represents about 5.5 million tons. So that 16% is 880,000 tons. So 2,000 pounds per ton of plastic, okay? And the other thing that's terrifying about that 16%, think about the weight of plastic and how light it is and the volume you're talking about. And then picture that being breaking down into tiny particles and becoming microplastics, and the potential, and this is just one state, the potential to pollute due to those microplastics. So again, most plastics are not recyclable. When I say not recyclable, perhaps you could take them into a lab and make plastic into plastic sometimes, but most of them cannot be recycled, meaning that there's no market and no facility to make that plastic into the same kind of plastic again. It literally does not exist. For numbers 3, 4, 6, and 7, which is other, there's no place to recycle them. Also remember that while number 1 and number 2 can be recycled, it's a few times, and the conditions have to be perfect. In other words, it has to be perfectly sorted. It can't have other types of plastic on the label or the cap. It has to be perfectly clean, and then it has to end up at the facility that actually will recycle them. Everything pushes against that, from the market to how difficult it is to sort all these different types of plastic, to the fact that there are just very few places to recycle them. And then again, remember, it can only happen a few times. Even if you had a perfect ton of perfectly clean number 1 or number 2 plastic, meaning PET or HDPE plastics, you can't recycle them infinitely the way you can a ton of aluminum or a ton of glass. So remember that recycling plastic is limited even in the ideal situation. The other thing to remember about this is not only that, plastics, most of them 3 through 7 can't be recycled. Sometimes you can recycle 5, but very, very rarely. You also can't recycle or sort curbside materials that are too small, meaning less than 2 inches. So little hotel toiletry bottles, for instance, or straws are never going to get recycled. They end up as trash. Filmy plastic is not recyclable, not sortable in the material recycling facilities where the plastics go from curbside to be sorted. And anything that's mixed. So if you have a carton that's lined with plastic, or a coffee cup, as we've already talked about, lined with plastic, that's not recyclable. In theory, in some places in the world, maybe in Germany, I know that they do this, and I know they do this in Korea, they will take some of the coffee cup and maybe recycle some of the cardboard piece, the paper fibers, but then they still have to burn the plastic. So this is not recycling. Recycling means making a cup into a cup. You can't do that. Another thing that's really important that we didn't understand well until the last few months is that plastics in curbside that were food grade. So say you've got a berry container or a bottle or some other plastic material that was used, a yogurt container for food, can never be recycled again into food grade plastic. The reason for this is that plastics absorb chemicals. Think about your Tupperware container, traditional Tupperware container with tomato sauce in it. Acidity and chemicals are absorbed by plastic. That's not true, for instance, of glass, but it is true of plastic. So what that means is if I have a ton of plastics that I've taken from curbside, and there's a bleach bottle in, or a bottle of Roundup or some other toxic, the whole load is toxic. And that means that it could actually poison someone if we made a bottle out, a soda bottle or a water bottle out of that load. So in other words, when we talk about plastic recycling, we can't make food grade plastic back into food grade plastic if it's been in curbside. We can't recycle anything but number 1 and number 2 plastics regularly. And we also can't recycle plastic that's not the perfect shape and size, perfectly sorted, and perfectly separated out from all other plastics. So if it's designed in such a way that there are other plastics involved, other materials design, not going to happen. So when we talk about recycling plastic, it's like a unicorn. It's just not something that works at large scale. The other thing to remember is that the industry, the petroleum industry, again, they're relying on selling the idea that this plastic is a recyclable circular material, a sustainable material, which it is not. As a result, they're pushing chemical recycling, which we can get into in some detail if you'd like to, really hard. And chemical recycling is breaking down the plastic into its constituents and then burning them. Because again, it doesn't make sense in the market because gas and oil are so subsidized to do anything but make virgin plastic. But further than that, they also don't have the technology and they don't have the sorting capability to actually make plastic out of their chemical or recycled, the feedstock that they create. So that chemical recycling is absolutely not recyclable, and I can tell you some stories about that. Another instance of greenwashing is TerraCycle. TerraCycle does not recycle post-consumer recycled content. In other words, so if material has been, a product has been used by the consumer and then sent back to TerraCycle, that's not going to get recycled. They do recycle some stuff, it seems, from industry, because industry will send them things from the cutting room floor, right? That they can recycle. But as far as those boxes of different plastic crap of all different shapes, sizes, and types of plastic, that's never going to get recycled. So, so there's a lot of greenwashing to pretend that plastic is a good idea when it is clearly not, and not recyclable. I have to click on the screen to go, okay. Another piece of this, and this is another thing that I could talk about forever. So, I'll be very brief tonight, but incinerators and landfills are not the answer, period, but they're definitely not the answer for plastic. Heating plastics at high heat, and again, remember, when we're burning plastics in an incinerator, many times we're mixing lots of different types of plastic if it's a chemical recycling facility. But in an incinerator, a mass burn incinerator for all trash, it's also mixed with electronics, hazardous waste, construction and demolition material, like a lot of different things that you're sending there that are toxic from your household and business trash. So as a result of that, you don't know how that's all going to mix and match at high heat. Chemicals and heavy metals especially, but things like PFAS, dioxin are actually sometimes created or augmented by these processes. So, we don't want to burn plastic because that's some of those plastics create dioxin when you burn them, one of the most dangerous chemicals known to man. PFAS too is lining many different materials that we are in the marketplace now. Some food packaging has PFAS in it. Nonstick pans. There's a huge list. Anything that's fireproofed has PFAS in it usually. Those PFAS, that family of chemicals, don't break down in the heat of an incinerator. The whole point of PFAS is not to break down in heat. So as a result of that, incinerators end up spewing these chemicals into the air, even if there's filter systems. And then even if there is a filter system, what happens is that a lot of the most toxic materials are then put in the ash. And what that means is then you have to landfill the ash. So for every 4 tons of waste that you have a ton of ash. Now, a lot of companies like to call this char and tell you that they can take this char and use it for filtering, and they can use the char for adding it to concrete. That's all nonsense. That's all greenwashing. Once again, you cannot make these toxics go away or contain them in a landfill or in concrete. Eventually, they're going to escape. Another thing to remember too, and a lot of people don't understand this, is that landfills are a hole in the ground with a plastic and clay liner, and then another plastic and clay liner that are there forever. And when I say forever, I mean forever. There is no way that we're ever going to mine or remove those toxic materials, that trash, from that landfill. It's way too expensive and dangerous to do. So what that means is, as water inevitably gets into the system, leachate is created, or toxic, landfill coffee, think of it. And so that trash coffee is then going to escape out the landfill through leaking. Or if the landfill is continuing to work and it is actually not leaking for some time, which, they don't leak for a while sometimes, but sometimes they leak right from day one. So it just depends. If it's not leaking, that leachate is collected and brought to sewer treatment plants. So PFAS and all the different chemicals that we were just talking about, and the chemicals that are present in plastic, like benzene and others that are very highly, highly dangerous contaminants, those toxics end up in the sewer treatment system. The sewer treatment system has no way to filter them. The sewer treatment systems are to deal with human waste. So they're dealing with nitrogen and bioload, and they're dealing with phosphorus. They do not have any systems in place to filter out these dangerous chemicals. So as a result, the outflow pipe where it goes into the river or the ocean is going to be full of these chemicals, and the microplastics, again, that are in that leachate as well. So and then also the sewage sludge then has to be disposed of, and that also is chock full of PFAS, microplastics, and all these different chemicals because of landfill leachate and other industrial polluters. So this whole system is built to fail and does fail every day. And that's, so when you put plastics into the trash, this is what we're talking about. It's either going to get incinerated in a landfill or end up on the side of the road. Okay. Now, again, this is another topic we could talk about for a long time, the climate damage piece around plastic. The life cycle of, plastic life cycle, again, I don't like that term, but the annual emissions are enormous. We see that the plastic disposal is really going to be, plastic production and disposal is really going to be consuming a lot of our carbon budget that's left. And it's just a terrible idea. One thing that I think folks need to understand is that there are a lot of lies around a lot of the life cycle analyses that you see out there. One of them is that many times they don't include any acknowledgement of toxicity or that extraction. So when you see an analysis that says, oh, plastic is much preferable to these other materials, usually what they've done is ignore toxicity, which is de rigueur, unfortunately, for a lot of these analyses. But then also a lot of times they've ignored the whole front end of the process. So just remember that if you're doing documents like that, to really take that seriously, because that's where a lot of terrible climate impact is. Another thing that we hear a lot from plastic companies and the American Chemistry Council is that light loading, making very light plastic bottles, is the best thing ever, because then you can drive around all these products and not have as much of an impact on the climate. We want to save that transportation climate impact. While, of course, we want to minimize the climate impact of transporting goods as much as we can, what they don't acknowledge there is that our choices are not either plastic bottles or brand new glass bottles, for instance. One of our choices, just to use the bottle example, is, for instance, to refill a lot of these containers, whether it's a bottle or an ice cream container or whatever it is. And remember that if you've got a virgin product, that's going to have the largest climate impact, both extraction, water use, energy use, and production. A lot of times there's a lot of high heat involved. That's going to have your biggest negative climate impact. Recycling has always a little bit less of a climate impact. And then the best one, however, for climate is always refill. So if you're refilling a glass bottle 40 or 50 times, the impact on climate is exponentially good as compared to a brand new plastic bottle every time. So what we should really be doing is pushing for those best case scenarios that also protect our health and also work for the climate. The impacts of real recycling and reuse are ignored. And then the idea that plastics, as I've already explained, are circular in any way, shape, or form is ridiculous, because even best case scenario, you can only recycle some of them, a limited number of times. You can recycle paper and cardboard a limited number of times, but you can compost it at the end. There are ways of actually dealing with it. Plastic doesn't have that kind of an option. Plastic's always going to be your worst choice. The other piece of this that I think is really, really important for everybody to understand is that the only reason that the petrochemical industry has been able to get away with what they have been is they've targeted people of color. They've targeted low-income communities. There's a great article, I think it was in The Guardian, that talked about the ownership of plantations and the Black townships that were established between plantations, and that now those plantations are now petrochemical facilities in Louisiana. And there still are people of color living around them. And that's one of the ways that they've built out this horrible infrastructure, this horrible polluting infrastructure, and created things like Cancer Alley, development like that. So every time you're looking at plastic, one of the ways I think that we can stop this at a national and international level is to say, if you want to build this, you can't build it in a community that is already burdened, already suffering from these historic injustices. You can't build these facilities in an EJ community. And when we push that way, maybe we'll then start to get some justice, because if we don't protect everybody, we're all going to suffer. So this is something that I don't know how much time you want to spend on this today, but there's stuff that we can do, and a lot of this problem is solvable. And I've already alluded to some of the things that we can do. The Cape Cod example of the bottle bans, I think, is a fantastic one. We are seeing the industry, especially the water industry, really frightened that they're not going to be able to sell their products. So they're coming to the table talking about bottle bills and refill systems. Now, are they doing enough? No. And should we be selling water? No. Selling water is a fool's game. But we should never accept that. But at least it shows that pressure that very local action can have on the state and national level. And again, I think I've mentioned these before, deposit return systems, which should be moving towards refill systems, and then extended producer responsibility for packaging, which can help, but of course it has to be done right. We want to make sure, for instance, there was a Connecticut bill this session on an extended producer responsibility for packaging paper bill that would allow this chemical recycling, high heat tech, as a form of recycling under the bill. As soon as you see that, it's greenwashing, and that's never going to actually reduce packaging, spur any recycling, and it's not going to work, period. So again, all of these pieces need to be done right, and we need to be really aggressive about them. And a lot of times the local piece helps a lot. We're seeing bottle bills move at the state levels. Oregon has started a refill system. but we really need, that to be the goal. I'm really hoping that maybe we can see some action in Hawaii, for instance. That's a perfect place for a refill system. Chile has just passed a law saying that 30% of their beverage containers are all going to be refillable from now on. And remember, we used to do this in the 1970s here in the United States. It's still happening in Mexico. It's still happening in parts of Germany. Like, this is something we can do. And as I already said, extended producer responsibility systems where we create a central fund that then's paid out to recycling, and the funds are based on how recyclable or reusable the packaging is. Those can work, but they have to be done right. And we certainly need a lot more practice in the United States to do these things right. Yeah, so to end this, if we're going to transition and build new systems, they have to be just, they have to be sustainable, they have to actually be circular, and they have to not poison us when we're using them. Remember that even your aluminum can is lined with plastic. It's a problem. I'm really worried about our health, and the best thing that you can do to solve this problem is to vote, is to call your legislator. Legislators tell me all the time, if they get 5 or 6 calls, 3 or 4 calls, they think their constituents are really concerned about something. So it doesn't have to be tens of thousands of people to make a difference, as I think sustainable practices has shown. If the right people show up and are aggressive and get other folks in the door, that can make all the difference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kirstie. We really appreciate your taking the time to speak with us. I'm going to open it up to questions, and I'm going to ask you please to put your question in the chat, and I will read the questions to Kirstie. If there's a need for additional explanation, I will call on you. But we do have one question, and the first question is related to COVID. Given the fear of COVID and other viruses, are there viable alternatives to plastics in hospitals and other settings where hygiene is crucial?
That's a really good question. So a couple different things on COVID, and I know you didn't exactly ask this, but I'm going to go a little further if that's okay. First off, what happened as soon as COVID hit is the plastic industry said, well, better get rid of your reusable bags, better get rid of reusables because COVID's a problem. That's not true. And that's something that we need to make sure everybody understands, that COVID is not spread on surfaces, that the rules that govern public health, if you're buying a cup of coffee in a reusable container, or getting a meal at a restaurant on a dish, all the sterilization that's always been in place here in the United States around public health works perfectly fine for COVID. So there's no reason to avoid reusables in any way, shape, or form in your normal life. Those are some things, we want to be clean. You want to throw your grocery bags in the wash every once in a while, but honestly, none of that is a problem. When it comes to hospital plastics, I put that in the same category that I would, for instance, my contact lenses, right? There are certain things that are difficult that we are going to need plastics for. Now, I don't think necessarily we need as much plastic as we do. I don't know about folks who've gone to the dentist recently, but I'm always amazed at the amount of plastic the dentist is using now as compared to when I was a kid. And when I was a kid, and I've asked the dentist about this, they had a sterilization machine in office, and they would use the same things. Now they're sending things out, and they come back encased in plastic, and they have to take the little monster pick thing that gives all of us nightmares to pick at your teeth. They have to take that out of the plastic and use it. So and then also the dentist is handing me a plastic bag with a new plastic toothbrush in it every time I go into the dentist. So there are definitely ways in which the medical industry could minimize some of what it's doing, but that's the tip of the iceberg. Like, to put it in perspective, in Massachusetts, we're talking about 8.5 billion bottles and cans each year. That's a lot more than what we're dealing with for medical issues. The other thing too, and I thought this was really neat, I talked to a guy who's working on medical plastic recycling. Obviously, you want to make sure that you're being very careful about contamination, not meaning contamination of plastics, but contamination, of disease, any illnesses. But what he was saying to me reflects everything that we see in our curbside systems and the problems we see with plastic in general. You need to actually have a system that uses one polymer and consistently uses that polymer and sets up a system of sorting so that your any other human waste is separate and any paper waste is separate than the plastic. And and it's just that one polymer, so you could actually recycle it in a economical way. So again, same problems that we're seeing everywhere else, not as much of a concern of mine just because of the raw tonnages we're talking about.
Now, when we talk about plastic, also, is there a trade-off that people aren't thinking about when it comes to the present versus the future? Because even if they have that convenience component today, they're going to be paying for it going forward. So is there any way that you could perhaps rephrase that in the way that people could think about it going when they have a conversation with someone?
Yeah, that's a good point. I also think that excuse me, it's very worthwhile to explain to people that they should be concerned by the exposure they're getting from saran wrap or a Tupperware container already. Never mind the food that we're purchasing in plastic. So definitely the convenience piece, that might be an issue. I honestly think that we can make reusable systems just as convenient. And I honestly think most people too like to follow the rules once there are good, sensible rules in place. I think the seatbelt laws in Massachusetts are a good example of that. If you had a kiosk to return your metal coffee cup to, even if you forgot to bring your own, or you just brought it the next day you came to the coffee shop, you're not going to have a big problem. That's pretty convenient. I think it's more about just putting systems in place that make it convenient for folks.
Thank you. Before I go to the next question, just want to share with everyone, we have a relationship with Allison Rogers, who is the CEO and founder of Useful, and her family is here on the Cape too. And she actually has that intermediary type service product, which she provides to coffee shops so they can distribute stainless steel coffee cups, that are then reusable after a person consumes that, and they can drop them in a convenient location. Obviously, it only works in closed loop systems like corporate campuses, college campuses, schools, but it is a start. It's a way of making reuse easier. So
I think that's also the way of the future in a lot of ways. There are whole regions in Australia and Germany that are doing this. Doesn't have to be just, it could be, why don't we have a Boss Cup? That's where I'd love to see Allison's work go, because she's doing a great job and we can do this.
The next question is related to single-use plastic bottles. So this question is, how many times can a plastic water bottle be refilled by an individual consumer and reused? And is there a safe plastic that can be refilled multiple times?
I mean, so you mean a reusable plastic water bottle, like when you purchase yourself, and how many times can you refill it? I think that the problem with plastic, as we've already said, is that it absorbs chemicals. And so and also it has some chemicals in it. There are less safe and more safe plastics. I'm going to get them mixed up. I thought number 2 was considered the least interactive, HDPE. If someone knows, please let me know. But I think, again, number 6 is one of the worst ones. It depends. I would say don't buy a plastic water bottle. I would say buy a metal one, honestly, or a glass one, depending on what your preference is. You just want to avoid plastic when you can.
Thank you very much. And if I could just add to your answer too, the thinner the plastic, which is what typically the single-use plastic water bottles are, the temperature change. So more likely that you'll see a leachate especially happening after successive use.
Do you think people mean that they?
The chemical yes.
Do you mean refilling an existing water bottle?
Yes.
Oh, don't like a single-use one that you like a disposable. Oh, don't do that. Just don't do that. No. Don't buy bottled water unless it's an emergency. Just don't. No.
And the question about looking at a bottle, a plastic water bottle that can be refilled, typically those kinds of plastic bottles have a BPA component to them.
Oh, yeah.
Find out that they are BPA free, because BPA actually affects your hormones. So
yes, and BPA is also on receipts. Don't touch any receipts. Don't accept them if you can. It's really dangerous. Yeah, that plastic is nasty.
The next question is, Trader Joe's claims that their plastic bags, the ones that you put your vegetables in, are biodegradable. Is that true?
I don't know about the Trader Joe's ones. I am very skeptical of biodegradable and compostable plastics. On the one hand, I think that they're, a poor supplement or solution because, again, we want to be moving to reusables. The other reason that they're a bad idea is that people will assume something is a compostable or biodegradable bag or plastic, say cutlery or whatever it is, when it's actually not. And so what that means is that composting systems that we're seeing a lot of composting systems really being launched throughout the whole region, which is fantastic. We don't want those composting systems mucked up by any type of plastic. So better to keep something out if you're not sure. It's hard enough to keep all the little, plastic fruit stickers and other things out of the composting as it is. So, and then also what California has found, and again, there are a lot more composting systems in California than there are here, for instance. What they found is that, composting also takes a lot of resources. Composting also uses energy and water and labor. And while it's much less expensive than our disposal system per ton, you still have to have transport and all those other pieces that have an impact on the climate. So the best thing that you can do is compost as little as possible. You want to be reusing materials as much as possible. Disposables, even if they're recyclable, even if they're going to be compostable, always have a cost. So better to have reusable bags when you can. Now, if for some reason you can't have a reusable bag, or say a bag is part of a food scrap collection service, you want to make sure that you look at the designation very carefully and see how it's designated as a compostable or a biodegradable bag. There are ISO standards that are supposed to line up and tell you that they actually are compostable or biodegradable. Remember though, that even then, even if you look into it and the number lines up with what the designation is for actually being biodegradable or compostable, even then you usually need what's called a commercial composting facility, meaning not your backyard and not an anaerobic digester where they slurry the food scraps, chop it up with water, and then take gas from it and then compost the digestate afterwards. That doesn't get hot enough. Composting piles, a windrow composting system gets, because they add enough air and because they add enough liquid to it and they keep it, perfectly at the right temperature and mix it just right. They get to about 120, I want to say, degrees. And that's when that biodegradable or compostable material will break down. It won't break down in your backyard, and it won't break down in a digester.
There's an additional question. What do you suggest? Where do you suggest we put our trash in when we take it to the local dump? After all bags are made of plastic.
That's a really good question. That's something that I wrestle with pretty regularly. Every time I try and buy some bags to, go to the dump, I wrestle with this. Again, try not to torture yourself. Because you all care, you are torturing yourselves just as I am. Try not to torture yourself. If you can, for instance, move to a shampoo bar, you've probably saved as much plastic as you would from those bags, those trash bags, right? So try and do the things that are more bang for your buck, like refilling a really big laundry bottle of laundry detergent. That's probably a lot more plastic than those plastic bags. And again, reusable bags at the grocery store, the things that you can do. That being said, I'm always torn. I try and get the thinnest bags I can. If you put a bag, whether it's compostable or biodegradable or not, in a landfill, it is not going to decompose. It will create methane regardless, and it's not a good thing. So, it's a no-win situation. What I think is the system we need to move towards is having our food not be in our trash. So you're no longer dealing with the odor or pest problem. And then have all your recyclables out of your trash, you should be getting down to very little trash. And then look at what you've got. Hopefully, maybe then you could put it in a trash can without a bag at some point. I'm hoping what we're moving towards. If we got all the recyclables and compostables out, we should be moving towards that as a system. but we're not there yet. And I know that. So I'm tortured by that question too.
How much of general household plastic recycling, in other words, curbside pickup, is actually recycled? And how is it possible that curbside pickup is sorted?
So if you look at your curbside bin, we've got 9 material recycling facilities in Massachusetts, and the stuff is literally just dumped there. So there are no bags there. Anything that isn't a bag is considered trash immediately. Anything that's too small and anything that's filmy or a tangler, so clothes or any filmy plastic like a plastic bag, is immediately trash as well. Okay, so that's all of that kind of stuff is trash, as per the designation of the system. Then your number one, plastic has some value. It does get pulled out and recycled, but I would say it's downcycled. It's not, a bottle is not made into a bottle. It's made into either clothes or some kind of again, plastic decking, for instance, is one that they do a lot. Number 2, same thing. It has some value. It's pulled out and it will get sold to a company that will downcycle it into some other plastic good. But you're not replacing virgin plastic. You're not replacing the next bottle. The next bottle is going to be made out of fracked gas or bottle plastic. The glass in your curbside recycling in Massachusetts, none of it is getting recycled according to Mass DEP. It's all getting ground and used as landfill cover or as roadbed. And then the aluminum is largely being pulled out and recycled, and the metal is largely being pulled out and recycled. And then none of the if you put cartons in, that's just trash. There's no carton recycling. There's no, even if they tell you they accept it because they've signed a contract with your town to accept it. They have no place to send it. And then number 6, number 5, all of that. What ends up happening, as far as we can tell, looking at the Springfield material recycling facility, is that all the leftover plastic, meaning 3, 4, 5, and 7, is bundled together, and they float some of the 5 out and recycle it at the facility, and then the rest of it's getting burned. So that's what's happening with their recycling right now. So what we really need to do, we need to get the glass out of the system through the bottle bill. We need to, the cardboard and paper do get recycled, but they'd be recycled at much higher rates and at much better values, and actually recycled rather than downcycled. If they didn't have bits of glass and plastic in them, they should be separated out. I know a lot of the Cape still has dual stream. Dual stream is much better than single stream because the paper and paper and cardboard is separated out up front. And then remember that even with all the numbers I've said, so 25% of what's going to MRFs is trash, or contamination, according to Mass DEP. Those loads of sorted materials, because the material recycling facilities don't work well, those loads of sorted materials also have significant contamination when they go to the facility that actually recycles them into something. Significant meaning 20, 30% sometimes. So curbside's a terrible system.
I'm going to go back to a question related to the grocery store again. So what can we do as consumers to get changes made at places like Trader Joe's to get rid of the plastic that they use to wrap their vegetables?
Well, one of the things that really does work well are statewide bans. Again, the grocery bag bans that have happened at the local level in Massachusetts, I'm hoping are going to lead to a statewide ban. We're still working on that. But that has happened in other states. Another piece, there are corporate campaigns. Some organizations do corporate campaigns, which I think brings attention to this. And then one thing that I've seen Mothers Out Front is starting actually in Brookline is a green grocer campaign, meaning talking to the 4 grocery stores in town and saying, what can you do about this? How can you make this better? Sometimes the store owner themselves can do something. Sometimes they need, corporate to sign off on it. But if you are working with them to solve some of these problems, that can be transformational. I've seen this work in California. It has happened in some places. It's a lot of work though. It's a tremendous amount of work. And you also have to be a good mix of a person who can communicate and understand the challenges that a manager who's running a store faces, and the decisions that they don't have control over, and then also an advocate who's really making sure that this is publicized through the community and in a larger scale. So we're trying to partner with folks who are doing that to publicize a lot of that information, but it's still in its early stages. The other thing I would say, as far as in the category of making yourself crazy, remember that 60% of the packaging that we're talking about is not the packaging you're seeing in the store. It's the transport packaging. So there, to me, is a huge opportunity for us to decrease, to make sure, for instance, that large containers are used over again. They're not just cardboard, and that things are packed more efficiently, and there's less packing, as far as that goes, because that piece of it, all of those huge, I'm forgetting the word for the wooden pallets. All the pallets, for instance, there's a lot of reuse that could be happening there that isn't happening because there's not design and investment to make sure it does. So that, in a lot of ways, is even more of a trash problem than what you're seeing when what you put in your cart.
So there's a question now that's following up on the discussion of recycling. Should we abandon trying to recycle plastic and just recycle paper, cardboard, and magazines?
So I would say that we should. Yes, I think that we're at that point now. I mean, I'm not telling people not to recycle their number 1 and 2 plastic beverage containers, and it does get recycled through bottle bills, but it's not the answer. And this is something that we have been saying, is that recycling is not going to solve the problem. No matter what material you're talking about, recycling is not going to solve the problem. I think that for curbside to be worthwhile, it would be perfectly fine to have more sectioned containers. Like, that's one of the things they do in certain parts of Germany. Your curbside thing is broken down into 4 or 5 different little cubbies, and then they just dump them individually. It doesn't make sense to put all that together. And in Europe and Canada, they don't allow glass to be mixed in with other containers. So glass should definitely always be separate. Paper and cardboard should definitely always be separate. And then you've got your plastic. And it really, some countries only make beverage containers and food containers out of 2 types of plastic to try and minimize this problem. So, I think that acknowledging the unrecyclability of plastic is important, or the very, very limited recycling ability of plastic is very, very important. That is happening on some level still. They're still making clothes out of it, for instance. So I'm not saying I'm against that, but it's certainly not going to solve the problem.
Now, there's unfortunately a lot of finger pointing with, it's the producer's responsibility. It's the government's responsibility. You're putting too much responsibility on the individual to make the change. But historically speaking, all changes have started with individual grassroots action. All meaningful changes have, because regulation typically codifies social movements. So I know I've sort of said this already, but how would you support this statement that I've just made, Kirstie, if I could ask you?
So I think that, I'm a huge fan of Beyond Plastics, because one of the things that they're doing is working closely with grassroots groups around the country, making sure that they know everything we just talked about, that they have a good, solid environmental justice training under their belts, and then giving them toolkits to do different types of things. Like a greengrocer campaign could be one thing, different kinds of local bans, could, like the ones we've seen on the Cape, could be another. But there are lots of different types of campaigns, and if you have the fact sheets and information to do that, that's really huge. I totally agree with you. Anything meaningful has to come from the grassroots up. I see my job as trying to help folks figure out what the best policies are for the moment, because it's a moving target, and also to give good information so that they can go into their legislator and say, no, in Massachusetts, the glass is not getting recycled, and have that support. So I think that you're absolutely right. We need to be doing this from the ground up. I'm hoping that some of the grass tops will join us. I'm hoping that legislators get this more and more, and we keep working on it. There are a lot of folks at Mass DEP who care about these issues very much so. There's one guy who's going crazy because of all the cardboard being thrown away in the trash. He tells me about it all the time. So we have other allies, but they need the backing of real, regular people to have the political courage to do anything.
Now, one question that's aligned to this, and I'm going to open it just for any last questions after this one that I posed to Kirstie. And some of you may be familiar with this, but some states have actually legislated banning the ability for local communities to establish bans. So the ban that exists, for example, in the state of Michigan, the state of Massachusetts, if I'm not correct me, we have very similar one with regard to single-use plastic bags. That basically whatever rule that the governor put in place would supersede any local rules with regard to single-use plastic bags. How can we ensure that our local rights are not infringed? Because if we've just said that local movements are the basis for long-term change and regulatory change, by eliminating that ability, we are also allowing the state to intervene and keep those changes from happening on a broader scale.
So you mean that you mean that the governor, when he said we could still use plastic grocery bags because of COVID, you're saying, which has been lifted, I think, since then.
No,
Yeah.
there was a rule that they were going to put in as a state. It hasn't passed as far as I know, but the rule
No, it hasn't. Yeah.
was related to a plastic bag ban that was a state ban, but the language in it at the very last statement was that ban would supersede any other local bans. So it would be the prevailing ban. So in a way, I look at that as a similar type of thing as banning local bans, because if you're putting a state ban that disallows a higher threshold at the local.
I see what you're saying. Well, so yeah, I mean, this is what gets tricky. So on the one hand, some of our opponents on plastic, the Retail Association, it's a Retail Association of Massachusetts, for instance, has come around to the idea of banning plastic grocery bags so long as the rule is the same throughout the state. And I understand their perspective because they're trying to run stores throughout the state. That being said, if the statewide grocery bag ban, it allows for thicker plastic bags, for instance, what have we achieved? Especially if there's a better bag ban in a given city or town. The other problem too, remember, that complicates it all, is that towns are not allowed to put a fee on other disposable bags like paper. So what that means is the cities have put fees on paper and are moving people towards reusable bags. But in towns, like the town of Southbridge next to me, they banned plastic bags, but they're just passing up paper bags. And it's better, but it's not great. It'd be better if we moved to reusables. So this is where the policy runs up against the reality, and how do you do the best you can? In Massachusetts, I would say that the bag ban that is part of the omnibus plastics bill that actually was just added to the Senate climate bill is a good bag ban. It would do what we needed to do and is as good as the local ones. That being said, that's because the language is written so as not to preempt cities and towns on anything else. And it's only on the bag ban. So the bag ban will be the same throughout the state, but don't take any of their power anywhere else, because that's another thing that we've seen. We've seen the bans. We've also seen we're going to preempt your local law, and then we're going to preempt anything to do with plastic, which is also unacceptable. And then the other thing that we're seeing, this is even scarier, is that the American Chemistry Council across the country has passed about 16 different state laws that would allow chemical recycling facilities, or these plastic high heat facilities, to not be considered waste facilities. So they'd be totally able to run without waste facility oversight. And waste facility oversight is usually more onerous than other facilities. So because waste facilities are so dangerous. So we're seeing this in lots of different ways across the country. And you have to pick your spot, and also make sure that the policy you're actually behind in the end, and that you end up with, is worth it, is what I would say.
Thank you very much. We had one last question related to glass. And this is a comment that you made with regard to glass not being recyclable, but do you support glass being used in roads?
I mean, glass isn't toxic. You know, I've seen shredded bottles be used in roads too, including plastic. That's much worse, obviously. But we're running out of sand and glass. Like that's not. It's not. We're seeing, especially on the Cape, a lot of mining for sand that actually, in some places, may even switch up how the aquifers work. I mean, it's really dangerous. You know, on the South Shore, this has been happening. And so we need to preserve our sand and recycle our glass, really recycle it. I would call putting it in a roadbed downcycling. It's not terrible, but we have a limited number of resources we can't be losing this way. Also, recycling glass and reusing glass is so much better for the climate than, you know, mining the sand and other natural resources and then making glass from virgin materials.
I want to thank Kirstie very much for joining us today. We really appreciate this. There's so much more to learn, and having these facts in the back of our mind will actually make us better at being those change agents that I think most of us on this Zoom are looking to be or continue to be. Two other things, if I can make a simple announcement, we have 2 more of these sessions coming up the following 2 Thursdays. We will have Laura Ludwig from the Central Studies in Provincetown, speaking specifically about the marine debris issues that relate to plastic as well. And then I'm excited also to bring on Shimona Mujandar from Earth Island Institute. And Shimona will be talking about the Earth Island Institute's lawsuits against Coca-Cola and the former Nestle North America, which has now rebranded itself as a private equity company, Blue Triton. Both of these laws have specifically addressed the false advertising of sustainability that these 2 companies have actually perpetrated in marketing to Americans. And I think it'll be a really interesting and additive discussion to what Kirstie has started us off with. So thank you so much again, Kirstie, for joining us.
Thank you. So good to see you all.
Please do take a moment and go to our website, Sustainable Practices LTD, and go to the podcast tab, and you can listen a little bit more about Kirstie's discussion on the Bourne landfill specifically. And again, thank you and have a wonderful evening, everyone.